So last week, as Chris alluded to, we launched into a new series, and it's going to run on and off over the year. We're going to dip in and dip out and dip back in, and it's belonging. And we made a warm start around the communion table, a table where all are welcome and wanted and needed, where there is a place for everyone who comes in response to the call of Jesus. And I also talked about Paul Windsor's blog and his new front door mat, Yay, It's You, proclaimed to everyone who comes to their house, and how that is both a statement of fact, but it's also aspirational. And he talked about all the different ways that can be aspirational in our life and in our churches. And then when we got out to shared lunch at Rose and Alex's house, lo and behold, they had been paying attention while they joined online, and there was a Yay, It's You sign on the letterbox and a Yay, It's You placemat at the table, because we talked about placemats being a little bit like doormats in terms of marking that space and saying, you are welcome here, you're expected, you're wanted, you're needed, we've accounted for you. So this week we're continuing the theme, but we go from that beautiful simplicity of the welcome mat, of the table, into a far more complex, dynamic, multi-generational relationship involving land and empire and politics and people. New Zealand history is not a straightforward, yay, it's you account. So what is it to belong in this land, Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the Sunday closest to Waitangi Day? It is a day of great meaning, and I know there are some people like Pete and Penny who were there on Thursday, and I hope they'll share some reflections and free-for-all of great meaning, of ceremony, of speeches, of politics, yes, of protest, as we saw, of narrative and counter-narrative, of challenge and invitation to each and every person, to each and every organisation, and I believe to each and every church. And that's why, even though I am no treaty expert, I am no Day of Waitangi expert, I felt it was really important that I did my best to talk about this topic in our church today. What does it mean to belong here? Not just to have somewhere to live and a life to lead, a door to put a welcome mat in front of, but to care deeply for the history and the future of this land, to commit to being part of what is best, even when it is uncomfortable. What does it mean for us to believe the love of God is known in the person of Jesus, right here in New Zealand, as was said in our offering prayer, and to let that love remake us, to give us new hearts, new hope. At Auckland Girls Grammar School in the 1990s, I received a good New Zealand history education. I didn't learn anything about the Tudor kings and queens and their names and their dates like the boys up the road at Auckland Grammar, but I did learn a lot about the Treaty of Waitangi, about the two different texts, the English and the Te Reo, and the discrepancies or differences or contested translations, and I learned about the nefarious missionaries, because I was taught that the missionaries were unequivocally the worst. The whalers and the traders, they came and they mixed in and they got on with it and they fitted in. But those missionaries, they came with their superiority complex and their colonizing agenda and their very dubious translation skills. And I remember Ms. Cotter, my history teacher, rocking backwards and forwards at the front of the classroom as she denounced the missionaries in fury and indignation, saying to us, probably with spittle flying, "Girls, don't be thinking they had good intentions. They did not have good intentions." I knew a lot of missionaries, but I didn't have the vocab to question that narrative, not even within myself. But wholesale maliciousness didn't ring true for me. Anyone who's lived in a strange land as a minority at the mercy of the kindness and the welcome and the hospitality of the majority, would think twice about the motives of this tiny group of people who left everything they knew to heed the call of Jesus to the edge of the earth. I'm not saying they were pure of heart in every possible way. That's highly unlikely. But I think Ms. Cotter, bless her, and she did teach us great history, flattened a rich and complex story into one blunt assumption, those awful missionaries. So for decades, I honestly believed that the treaty was based on intentional trickery and either sloppy or sneaky translation by the missionaries. I never felt that as a New Zealander I should be personally concerned with honouring the treaty because I thought it had been so dishonourable to begin with. And I just lived with that discomfort and disconnect. It's only in recent years that I've learned more about the mutual care and mana behind the treaty. And of course, this is just one strand of the story. It's not the only story that can be told, but nor was Ms. Cotter's story the only story. And so maybe Yay, It's You isn't outside of the realm of possibility for some of those early relationships that came to the making of the treaty, and also for our country going forward. It won't be a simple Yay, It's You, but it could be possible when we think about mutual mana, dignity, and love. And that changed my view from the discomfort and the disconnect to gratitude and respect and commitment to learning and doing more. There is honour and there is sincerity in Te Tiriti, and it gives us something very special to stand on and to work from. And what's more, whether we are tangata whenua or tangata Te Tiriti, what's more, Christians can have an important role in honouring the treaty, given their part in the making of it. And yes, a lot of that history is an Anglican history and maybe a bit of Catholic history. It's not something that Baptists are particularly caught up in that early treaty making, but it is still the history of the church in New Zealand and it's important history for us. It's certainly true that things went downhill very quickly. Ms. Cotter wasn't wrong when it came to what the Crown was up to in New Zealand, and also the role that the church played, because even if just by their silence, churches were very complicit in the loss after loss after loss that Māori suffered in New Zealand, loss of land, loss of mana, loss of language, loss of whānau and natural support structures that people had. And yes, the Crown and the early settlers gained and gained and gained from that. So I'm not saying that the church has a glorious history. We have got as much or more than anyone to come to terms with. But Christians understand covenant and Christians understand justice. And even more importantly, perhaps, Christians understand love. I don't mean we're the only people who understand love. That's definitely not the case. But love is a subject that we are taught about in our Bibles. Love is a subject that Jesus was very interested in. Love is a subject that we, the church, across time and place, have given much collective thought and commitment to. Love one another, said Jesus. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And Alistair Rees gave a sermon at Waitangi Day last year at Waitangi, and he said, the treaty is a love letter. But it's not a lovey-dovey, romantic kind of love, though many people liken it to a marriage covenant, and in fact, Te Araha Roundtree picked up on that in her Waitangi address this year and said, subtext, Treaty Principles Bill, it's like the Crown is filing for a divorce while Māori are blissfully unaware. Both partners are not treating their covenant and their contract with the same respect. But as I say, the love expressed in Te Tiriti is not romantic, and nor is it just pragmatic. And it doesn't originate with the feelings of those involved, but with God. With God's creating love, with God's sustaining love, with God's reconciling love. In the treaty, there is recognition embedded about the duty of care that we have to each other as God's beloved creatures. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these, said Jesus. So just a very few points about the treaty, and most of this I've learned from the Common Grace material, and I'm going to try and compile some of this on our website because, as I say, I'm no expert and I'm not really the right person to be trying to tell this story, but here's some of the things I've learned. The first thing is that He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, was signed 5 years before the treaty. That was signed by a collective of Māori leaders who said that they were going to that they were sovereign, that no one else was sovereign, that they were going to meet at Waitangi each year to make governance decisions for the whole of the land, working together. And they called on the then King of England to, they thanked him for recognising their flag, and this is the flag. And I think you see it around more and more these days. Again, this is not something I learnt about at AGS, but more and more this He Whakaputanga discourse is becoming quite important in understanding the context of the treaty. So they thanked the king for recognising their flag and also called on the king to sort of recognise and nurture their new nation that they were creating in their agency, deciding to work together to govern the land. And then the treaty was signed 5 years later. Here is some of the treaty text in Te Reo Māori. Many of us will have learnt about the 3 written articles. The first one is the one that has a lot of questioning around the translation. Was it governance or was it sovereignty that was being given up and handed over to the Queen of England, because it was a queen now, not a king. Ned Fletcher, as Peter Lynham pointed out to me a year or so ago, has written an 800-page book. So I have not tackled the book, Peter. Have you read the book? Peter's read the book, so Peter can give the synopsis. But he's written looking at the English text of the treaty and arguing that actually the intentions there, it was not a nefarious translation, that the wording of the English text was actually what was conveyed in the Māori. Although he's not a te reo expert, as he says himself. So there's a lot of learning that is still happening. There's lots of uncovering still being done. The second article is about chieftainship, and if you're going to sell land, sell it to the Crown first, because that was a Crown interest. Third one is about Māori having citizenship and all the rights of British citizens. And then there's a fourth unwritten article, which again, I never heard about at AGS, but it's when Bishop Pompallier, and we've got Pompallier Terrace just around the corner from us, said, hey, we also need to have something about a right to religion. And so they had this fourth article of the treaty that was about everyone's right to their religion, and it was spoken, not written. Why would Māori sign the treaty if it really was based in trickery, and if there were plenty of perfectly smart people who could have worked that out? There were equal numbers of Māori and Pākehā in the country around 1840, so it wasn't a sense of, oh gosh, we've already been taken over, we may as well give up and get the best we can out of this. But there was a recognition that these wonderful whalers and traders and sailors who had come over to the country, they were creating a lot of lawlessness, a lot of problems around society. Darwin visited Russell in the 1820s or 30s and called it the hellhole of the Pacific because of that lawless behaviour that was coming from some of those whalers and sailors and traders early on. And so there was a sense for the Māori leaders that the king needed to come and deal with his people, that they were his problem and it would be his power that should be brought to bear on them. It was also advantageous for trade. Māori were recognising, as a new nation, that there was lots to be gained from connections with the wider world, and they could see the benefits of that, and they wanted a right and tight, proper sort of way of going about that. And they knew that the He Whakaputanga, their Declaration of Independence, had already been read out in the British Parliament. It was read somewhere in the United States, I'm not entirely sure where. So they knew that it was becoming known around the world that they were an established nation, and they wanted to take their place, sort of leaders to leaders, in what it meant to be a nation and to have the responsibilities and the benefits of that. There was the New Zealand Company. I know perhaps your relatives, Ruth and Kirsten, very distant relatives, who were claiming to have bought up land all around the country, had done very dodgy deals, didn't understand what they were doing, and on selling it to people who were over in England or other parts of the world. So that was really concerning for the missionaries, and it was concerning for the Crown too, because if anyone was going to be buying land, they wanted it to be them. And then, so that was another motivation for the treaty. And then the final one, which I think it's something I'd never heard before I encountered some of the Common Grace material. And this will, it's one story, it's not the story, but it is one of the stories. And that was the sort of moral and social revival, the rise of a moral consciousness, in England from the late 1700s and early 1800s. I'm really looking over at Peter Lynham as I'm trying to explain this. So the Clapham sect were really big influences in this, a group of people who I think were predominantly Anglican, but sort of evangelical Christians who were recognising the absolute importance of treating people well. And this goes back to this love idea. They were inspired, I think, by the sort of social conscience of people like John Wesley, who'd been prominent as a preacher, and they were the people. So William Wilberforce was a really significant part of this Clapham sect, and they were the people who were pushing for abolition of slavery, who were pushing for reform in prisons, who were starting up things to protect against cruelty to animals, which is intriguing. So this real sense of love and care that needed to have a practical outworking in how people were treating people. And so that kind of mindset and group of people, they weren't a group that called themselves the Clapham sect. That was kind of a label given to them later. They were a group of like-minded people who really strategized together and worked together for this social and moral convictions that they held in common that were based in the gospel. So that group with William Wilberforce had a big influence on someone called Sir James Stephen. In fact, William Wilberforce was the uncle of James Stephen. James Stephen became the secretary for the Colonial Office in the late 1830s. James Stephen, nephew of William Wilberforce, big part of this social revival, gospel social justice in England, was the person who wrote the instructions that were given to Lord Normanby that in turn went with Captain Hobson to New Zealand and were used in the drafting of the treaty. So there's one little thread that people are picking up on where we can see that the convictions of love and loving your neighbour were coming through into Te Tiriti of Waitangi. And at the heart of the treaty then, when you understand that thread, it's not unfair to recognise that there is conscience, and in Christian vocabulary there is love. And so Jay Luca is someone who's done a lot of work in this area, both research but also popularising in the church. This is information he wants the church to understand. So I'm just reading a little bit from one of his essays where he's also quoting someone called Keith Newman. The only reason New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi is because of concerned Christians applying political pressure who believed that British exploration and trading should be edged with a sense of responsibility for the people they encountered in far-off lands. The treaty was first thought of by Christians. The treaty was written by Christians. The treaty was translated and interpreted to Māori and the Crown by Christians. In other words, the treaty is not just national history, but a crucial part of our Christian story that we presently predominantly know nothing about. That's J. Ruka, a couple of decades ago. And he points out that all the copies of the treaty were taken around the country by missionaries, or in one case an ex-missionary, and that so much of it was based on the personal relationships that had been built between missionaries and between Māori, and a true sense of trust and what it meant to love your neighbour as yourself. So there's a lot more complexity to the story, but I think it is well worth understanding that that thread is part of the story. And as Alistair Rees said at Waitangi last year, we need to ask, why should the church step up? The treaty is in part a theological document. It cannot be understood truly without some biblical understanding. Some of its genesis, its language, and its covenantal intentions are drawn from Te Paipara. It is the church in these days, when the treaty is under attack, that should be reminding the nation about its covenantal commitment. And he also said, love is the hermeneutical portal. That's the interpretation, the way we interpret. Love is the hermeneutical portal for understanding the treaty. It's the interpretive key. Without love, it's an empty rhetoric and a legalistic doctrine. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. What does it mean to belong in this land? It means coming to grips with love, leaning into love, and asking that God will give us new hearts to love.